The language they said we couldn't own. Have you ever been told that you weren't good enough? That no matter how hard you worked, the world had already decided your limits? For generations, that's been the quiet, invisible burden carried by many Filipinos, especially when it came to English. Yes, people around the world admitted Filipinos spoke it fluently. Some even praised their accent as clear, their grammar as solid. But when it came to academic English, the language of research papers, universities, and intellectual debate, the praise stopped short. They can speak it, the critics whispered, but they don't truly understand it. It was the kind of judgment that hid behind polite smiles, soft, but sharp enough to cut. And yet, what if I told you that at some of the most respected universities in the world, professors eventually began asking Filipinos not just to participate in class, but to teach them. To teach them how to write more clearly, to speak more powerfully, to think in English not as a weapon, but as a bridge. It sounds too good to be true, but the story of Maria from Cebu proves otherwise. Because sometimes, the underestimated don't shout to be heard. They rise quietly, until even the loudest voices are forced to stop and listen. Maria was the daughter of a public school teacher and a tricycle driver. She grew up in the rhythm of everyday Filipino life. The crowing of roosters at dawn, the laughter of children chasing one another down narrow streets, the echo of church bells on Sunday mornings. Her world was small, but full of meaning. In school, she wasn't the loudest. She didn't raise her hand first. But she listened. She loved words, not because they made her sound smart, but because they helped her understand people. Her teachers drilled grammar and essay writing into their students. But there was always a deeper lesson hidden beneath the worksheets and red ink. Write not to confuse, but to connect. Speak not to impress, but to be understood. Those words stuck with her. When Maria won a scholarship to study linguistics in London, her entire barangay celebrated as if one of their own had won a crown. Neighbors brought food. The parish priest blessed her trip. Her father cried quietly at the airport, pressing her hand as if to say, "Don't forget where you come from." She boarded the plane, not just with her luggage, but with the weight of her community's hope. London was another world. The air was colder, the people brisk, the buildings towering like castles. In her first seminar, Maria sat quietly at the back, notebook open, pen trembling slightly. Around her were students from Germany, Japan, France, and the United States. They spoke quickly, confidently, tossing around academic jargon like they were born to do it. Maria felt that old whisper return. "You don't belong here. You're just a girl from Cebu." Then came the first assignment, a 10-page research essay meant to test their mastery of academic English. Maria approached it the only way she knew, patiently, methodically. She stayed late in the library, surrounded by towers of books. She outlined her arguments carefully, trimming every sentence until it was lean and clear. She remembered her teacher's voice. "Write so that even a child can understand you." When the papers were returned, the air filled with sighs and groans. Pages were covered in red ink. Students buried their faces in disappointment. Maria braced herself, but when her professor handed her essay back, she froze. At the top, in bold handwriting, were the words, "This is the most precise and well-structured essay I've read all semester. Could you explain your method after class?" Her heart skipped. Around her, heads turned. Some looked surprised, others skeptical. The Filipino student praised above the rest. After class, the professor approached her. "Your clarity is remarkable," he said. "Most students write with complicated words, but their arguments collapse. You write so anyone can follow." That is true academic English. Maria smiled shyly. Something shifted inside her that day. The doubts didn't vanish, but a seed of confidence began to grow. Maybe the way Filipinos had been taught English, patiently, humbly, with clarity, wasn't a weakness after all. Maybe it was their hidden strength. She didn't celebrate with fanfare. That night, she returned to her tiny dorm room, sat on her bed, and whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. She thought of her mother, correcting her essays by candlelight, her father teaching her to speak slowly so everyone could understand, her teachers who said respect mattered more than big words. The irony was clear now. The very qualities the world mocked about Filipino English were the same qualities that made it stand out in the birthplace of the language itself. But Maria's journey didn't stop there. In the following weeks, something unexpected happened. Her classmates began approaching her. A German student asked softly, "How do you make your essays so easy to read? I get lost in mine." A Japanese researcher whispered, "Can you check my draft before I submit it? I need help making it clearer." Even a French student admitted, "Your writing feels alive. Ours sounds like we're hiding behind words." Maria was stunned. All her life, she had believed Filipino English was second-hand. Yet here she was, teaching students from countries that claimed ownership of it. One evening, she sat in the library, surrounded by her new friends, editing their essays. They listened carefully, jotting down her suggestions as if she were the professor. She laughed quietly and thought, if only my teachers in Cebu could see this, they would smile. But her confidence was tested again. During a seminar, a tall student from Eastern Europe interrupted her presentation. "Your accent," he said bluntly, "doesn't sound academic." The words hit her like a slap. For a moment, her throat tightened. The old shame threatened to return. But she took a breath and continued. Instead of trying to sound like someone else, she leaned into what she knew best. She compared language learning to tending a garden, words that must be planted, watered, and given sunlight before they can grow. As she spoke, the room grew silent. No one heard her accent anymore. They heard her message. When she finished, her professor simply said, "That was beautiful." That night, Maria realized something profound. Filipinos had never truly borrowed English. They had transformed it, made it their own. They used it not to dominate, but to connect, not to sound superior, but to make people feel seen. And maybe that's why the world is beginning to notice. Because in the quiet confidence of voices like Maria's, the story of an entire nation is being rewritten, one clear, powerful sentence at a time. When Maria finished her presentation, there was silence. Then, slowly, the professor stood. "You have taught us more in 15 minutes, he said, his voice steady but full of emotion, than most do in a whole semester. It is not your accent that matters, Maria. It is your clarity. It is your humanity." For a moment, the words hung in the air, soft but thunderous. The class began to clap. Maria blinked back tears. What she once thought was her weakness had become her strength. That night, she sat by her dorm window, watching the London rain fall against the glass. She began to wonder, why was this happening? Why were Filipinos so often underestimated, so good at making English simple, beautiful, and alive. She remembered her mother saying, "An idea is useless if people cannot understand it." And suddenly, memories came flooding back. She thought of the call center workers in Manila, staying up through the night, softening their tone so tired customers across the ocean would feel at ease. She thought of teachers in small towns explaining Shakespeare using examples from rice fields, jeepneys, and church hymns, turning the foreign into something familiar. It struck her. Filipino English had never just been about grammar. It had always been about heart, about making knowledge belong to everyone, not just the elite. And the world was beginning to see it. Soon, Maria was invited to lead a small workshop on academic writing. The irony was sharp and beautiful. The Filipino student who had once doubted herself was now being asked to teach others how to master their own language. She prepared nervously, pacing in her room, whispering lines under her breath. But when the day came and she stood before her classmates, something inside her calmed. She remembered her father's last words at the airport. "Do not forget where you come from." She spoke not as a foreigner trying to prove herself, but as a daughter of the Philippines, carrying the wisdom of her homeland. "In my country," she began, "we are taught that respect is not only shown through our actions, but through how we speak and write. When we communicate, we try to make things clear, not because we are simple-minded, but because we honor the person listening." The room grew still. A student from America raised his hand and said, "That's the opposite of how we were trained. We write to sound smart, not to make others understand." Maria smiled gently. "But what good is sounding smart," she asked, "if no one truly understands you?" And there was no reply, only thoughtful silence. As the weeks passed, Maria's name began to circulate quietly through the university. Professors mentioned her essays in class. Students spoke about how her feedback transformed their writing. And then, one afternoon, an email arrived. She was being called to the department office. Maria walked nervously down a corridor lined with portraits of scholars, names etched in gold beneath solemn faces. Inside, her professor was waiting. "Maria," he said, smiling, "I want you to co-lead a seminar with me next week. The topic is clarity in academic writing. I believe you can teach them something even I cannot." Maria froze. "A co-lecture," she whispered. "Sir, I'm not qualified. I'm still learning." The professor leaned forward. "You are qualified because you write with honesty and precision. That is what these students need most. Never underestimate yourself." That night, she could not sleep. She thought of her mother's voice. "Knowledge is not measured by how difficult you sound, but by how deeply you can be understood." She thought of her father, whose English was broken, but whose wisdom was whole. Maybe, she thought, this was her moment, not to prove herself, but to prove that the way Filipinos had been using English all along was not a weakness. It was strength disguised as humility. The day of the seminar arrived. The classroom was packed. Students filled every chair, some standing at the back. Professors sat along the wall, notebooks ready. The air buzzed with curiosity. The professor opened the session briefly, then turned to her. "Today," he said, "we are honored to learn from one of our own students, whose writing has reminded me of the true purpose of language." Maria's palms were sweating. Her voice trembled as she began. But then she remembered the jeepney rides of her childhood, filled with laughter and stories. She remembered reading scripture aloud at church, speaking slowly, so even the elders could hear. And suddenly, her voice steadied. "In my country," she began, "we do not write or speak in English to sound superior. We do it to make sure the other person understands, because language is not just knowledge. It is respect. It is kindness." The room was silent. You could hear the faint hum of the radiator. Maria went on. She showed how a 10-line sentence could be reduced to 3 and become stronger. She explained how good writing was like a conversation, not a lecture. She even used simple metaphors from home. "Think of your essay like cooking rice," she said, smiling. "If you add too much water, it turns to mush. Add too little, and it burns. But if you balance it just right, it feeds everyone." Laughter rippled through the room. But then came the nods, the kind of quiet agreement that means something has landed deep. Even the professors were scribbling down her words. For the first time, Maria was not being evaluated. She was teaching. When the seminar ended, the room erupted in applause. A tall student from America approached her. "You just made me realize why I always struggled," he said. "I was writing to impress my professors, not to connect with them." Another student from the Middle East added, "You explained in 1 hour what I haven't understood in 3 years." But the moment that stayed with Maria came quietly. An elderly professor, his hair silver and hands trembling slightly, walked up to her and said, "For years we have taught English as a science, dissecting it, demanding precision. But you've reminded us that it's also an art of clarity, humility, and connection. Do not ever forget this gift you carry. It does not belong to you alone. It belongs to your people." Maria's throat tightened. She could not speak. Tears filled her eyes as she realized that this moment was bigger than her. She was not standing there only as Maria from Cebu. She was carrying the voices of millions. Teachers who shaped minds in candlelit classrooms, call center workers who soothed strangers' frustrations with calm voices, mothers and fathers who prayed in English mixed with Tagalog or Cebuano, believing words could heal and unite. That night, as she walked back to her dorm under the soft London fog, she lifted her head high. For the first time, she understood completely. The story of Filipino English was not one of imitation. It was a story of transformation. A language once borrowed had been turned into something unique, something powerful, something deeply human. The world had underestimated the Philippines. For generations, the country had been seen as a follower, never the teacher, never the voice of authority. But that old belief was beginning to crack, and Maria could feel it. Her journey was just one small spark in something much larger, an awakening of a nation's quiet strength. After that unforgettable seminar, everything changed. Maria was no longer the shy girl sitting at the back of the classroom. Students who once ignored her now sought her out for help. Professors who once saw her as just another face began to introduce her as a colleague, an equal. But even with the recognition, Maria knew something deeper was happening, something that had little to do with her name, her grades, or her speech. This was about something that stretched across oceans and centuries, something that belonged to her people. That night, she sat by her dorm window, the London skyline glowing outside, majestic, cold, and alive with history. But her heart wasn't in London. It was back home in Cebu. She pictured her mother, checking homework under the soft light of a kerosene lamp. Her father, his hands rough from work, listening as she read her essays out loud. Her teachers, underpaid, overworked, but unshakable in their belief that good English was not for prestige, but for respect. In that moment, Maria understood. Every word she had spoken in that seminar wasn't hers alone. It was the voice of millions, of nurses, teachers, seafarers, caregivers, Filipinos who had turned English into something more than a foreign language. They had made it their own. Gentle, clear, sincere. A bridge, not a barrier. The world had mistaken that gentleness for weakness. But in truth, it was strength. Quiet, deliberate, unshakable. As she reflected, scenes flooded her mind. Filipino nurses in London hospitals, soothing patients not just with medicine, but with calm, kind words. Seafarers navigating dangerous seas with precise communication that saved lives. Caregivers explaining instructions with patience and care. They had been teaching the world all along, not through lectures or textbooks, but through everyday acts of compassion. For too long, the world had underestimated her people. They were seen as workers who could follow orders, not thinkers who could lead. But here was Maria, standing before scholars from across the world, being asked to teach them how to speak clearly. And suddenly she realized, this was not luck, this was justice. This was history finding its balance. One afternoon, as she crossed the campus gardens, Maria overheard two professors talking. "I used to think Filipino English was just a colonial leftover," one said. "But now I see it's something else, something evolved. It carries warmth. It carries clarity. Maybe it's closer to the real spirit of English than what we speak ourselves." Maria stopped walking. Those words sank deep into her heart. For the first time, she saw English not as something borrowed from the West, but as something reshaped, reclaimed. Filipinos had not just learned English. They had transformed it, infused it with respect, patience, and heart. She began to see a new story for her country, not one of catching up, but of leading quietly. The Philippines wasn't just borrowing from the world. It was giving something back, a new way to communicate, human to human, soul to soul. That night, over coffee with classmates, she shared these thoughts. A student from India said softly, "In my country, English often feels like a wall, but when Filipinos speak, it feels like an invitation." Another from Egypt nodded. "You make us remember that language is not just about words, it's about dignity." Maria smiled. She didn't need to argue anymore. The truth was already speaking for itself. One Sunday, she attended Mass in a small church tucked between London's crowded streets. The Filipino choir sang hymns in English, their accents laced with Tagalog and Bisaya. As their voices filled the air, Maria felt tears rise in her eyes. Even here, thousands of miles from home, Filipinos carried their faith, their humility, their music, and their gift of language as a bridge to others. She whispered a prayer. "Lord, let me honor my people. Let me show the world who we are." From that day, Maria carried herself differently. She was no longer just Maria from Cebu. She was Maria the Filipino, a voice of a nation the world had long underestimated, yet one that had been shaping the world in quiet, powerful ways. Later, she would stand again before scholars, this time not as a student, but as a speaker. She spoke slowly, carefully, letting each word land. She told them of her teachers back home, of her father's lessons, of the Filipino belief that true communication isn't about showing off, but about being understood. Our English, she said, was shaped not by conquest, but by compassion. We learn to make knowledge accessible, not intimidating. Because real language doesn't build walls, it opens doors. The hall was silent. Then came the applause, soft at first, then rising until the entire room was standing. Maria's eyes blurred with tears. This wasn't just her victory. It was her country's moment of recognition. Afterwards, professors approached her one by one. "I've taught for 30 years," said one from Oxford, "but today I remembered why clarity matters." A professor from Japan added, "If my students want to learn true clarity, I'll tell them to look to the Philippines." Maria stepped outside into the London evening. The wind was cold, but her heart burned with warmth. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "Salamat," thank you, to her family, her teachers, her people. Because her journey had given her something far more valuable than recognition. It had given her a mission, to tell the world that the Philippines carries a gift it desperately needs. Not power, not wealth, but clarity, humility, and humanity in communication. That is the legacy. That is the truth no one can deny anymore. So the next time someone says, "Filipinos don't know real English," remember Maria. Remember the professors who turned to her for guidance. Remember the countless Filipino voices across the world, speaking not to impress, but to connect. Because in the end, the strength of a nation isn't always measured by armies or money. Sometimes it's measured by the quiet power of words spoken with honesty. And in that, the Philippines stands tall. If this story touched you, share it. Because somewhere out there, another Maria is waiting to be reminded that her voice and her nation's voice matters.